Hello, everybody. Welcome back to ROM Storytime. I have missed you all so very, very, very much. I can see you in the chat, and I am so excited to be talking to you again. But I'm not alone this time. I have brought a special guest with me. Boom! This is Christian.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. Christian, do you want to introduce yourself and tell everybody why you're here?
Sure, I'd love to. Hi, I'm Christian. I work at the museum with Sarah at the ROM. My job is to find ways to make the museum a space for everyone, a space where everybody feels comfortable, and a space where everybody's stories are heard and valued. And speaking of stories, you may have noticed that neither Sarah or I were here on ROM Storytime last week. And that was on purpose. That was on purpose because last week, our Black community was hurting, upset, and calling out for change, fairness, and justice. To make sure that their voices were heard, we at ROM Storytime stopped talking. Ours were not the voices that you needed to hear last week. And we needed the time to think about how we can continue to share important stories with you. So, for the next few weeks, we're going to be reading some wonderful stories that help us talk about what you may have heard or talked about with the adults over the past few days. Things like differences in our cultures and stories, in the way we look, and how we are seen in the world. Last week we went quiet to let other voices be heard, but what's important now is we want to make sure that those voices say it loud. So Sarah, I think we've got a pretty great book today for that.
Absolutely. And Christian, I'm going to apologize. I'm going to take you off the screen for just a second so that I can show our friends what this week's book looks like. It's called The Day You Begin by Jacqueline Woodson, and it's illustrated by Rafael López. And I want to say a huge thank you to Penguin Random House for letting us read this book this week. And this is an amazing book about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and how those stories can create bridges between you and me and all of our friends around us. And it's also about finding courage to tell your story even when you feel, scared and alone and like you're not like anybody else in the room. So all of our friends in chat are saying hi to you, Christian.
Hello, chat.
Yay.
Nice to see you. Not see you. Virtually almost see you.
And are we ready? Are you ready, Christian, for your first ROM story time?
I am. I'm gonna get this read along going.
All right.
But you're gonna read first, I think.
Yes. So we're gonna start off with The Day You Begin. Hey, everybody. Sorry to interrupt. It is Sarah from the future with an important message for you. Now, unfortunately, after the 2020 school year ends, we can't keep the read aloud portion of the story time in the Storytime broadcast, but don't worry, I've got something special for you. Now, in the meantime, we do encourage you to pick up a copy of this book. You can sign it out of your library. Get your grown-ups help to share your thoughts with us at ROM Toronto, #ROM@home, because we would love to hear what you think of this book. But in the meantime, here is Sarah's super fast Storytime Summary. Okay, so there's this girl starting a new class, and she realizes that sometimes when you go into a room, no one there will be quite like you. Maybe it's your skin, or your hair, or the way you dress, or the language you speak that sometimes people don't understand. And people laugh at things they don't understand too, but that doesn't mean your language isn't beautiful. Sometimes when people are showing off the cool things they did on vacation, you don't know what to say because you didn't go anywhere. You spent the summer reading to your sister. Sometimes people don't understand what's in your lunch, and because they don't understand, they don't love it like you do. Sometimes you feel like you're alone, on the outside of everything, and all you have is your own brave self. And that's when you begin to share your stories. And so the girl in our story says that her name is Angelina, and tells the class about the awesome adventures she had reading with her sister. And Rigoberto says that his sister's name is Angelina, and Angelina starts to see the space in the world for her. And realizes that this is the day you begin to find the places inside your laughter and your lunches, your books, your travel, and your stories. where every new friend has something a little like you and something else so fabulously not quite like you at all. All right, so that was our story, friends. Christian, your very first ROM story time. What did you think?
It was great. I really enjoyed the story.
It was a great story. And I love that the story is all about finding stories. And one of the reasons that we picked this book is because at the museum, we had an exhibition called The Family Camera. And I'm going to cover us up, Christian, a little bit so I can show our friends what it looked like. So there is one part of it. There is another part of it. So it was a whole exhibition just about family photographs. And it was about what these photographs tell us about ourselves and the world around us, and about families, and about finding families through things like migration, coming from one place to another, and finding families in ways like adoption.
And I think that's a really important point, Sarah, is museums ultimately are places that tell stories. So I like this book a lot because it talks about the ways that we use stories to connect. Because I mean, without stories, a museum would just kind of be like a attic full of stuff, or your basement where, you know, you put stuff that you might not think about again.
Yeah, gathers dust. Nobody ever gets to learn what it was or who brought it to life. Yeah. So, friends, this week, if you have any questions about the book that we just read, or about Family Camera, or especially about how the museum and people like Christian at the museum help us to tell people's stories, that can go in the chat. You can start typing it in right now, and while you're getting your questions into the chat, let's take a look at this week's Creativity Challenge. Our story this week is about beginning to share our stories. In the book, we learned that personal stories help us find the ways in which our friends have something a little like us, and something else so fabulously not quite us at all. Every person is made up of stories that combine together to make us who we are. One exhibition at the ROM, called The Family Camera, was all about the power of stories. It explored how personal stories help us understand a lot more, not just about where we personally come from, but also about the world around us. For our creativity challenge this week, we're going to be like the new friends we made in The Day You Begin and start to share our own stories with our new friends. Choose one story that's important to you and that you feel comfortable sharing with other people. There are no limits to what this story could be. It might be a story about a scar you got on an adventure with a friend, an important treasure you found on a journey, or that you made with a loved one. Your favorite meal that you've learned how to make? Anything at all, as long as it's about you. Find a way to share your story that feels right to you. You could draw a picture, share a photo, write a poem, make a video, or find another creative way to tell your story. Share your stories with us at ROM Toronto, #ROM@home. All right, so that is our creativity challenge for this week. And if you want to see it again, this hand, there it is. rom.on.ca/storytime is where it lives, and it's where the recording of our story this week will live. And if you visit that page, when it goes up in the next day or two, you'll also be able to find links to all of the photographs from Family Camera that went up as part of that exhibition in our online collections. And when you see the photograph, there'll be a part on the page that says description and a little plus. And if you click on that little plus, you'll find all of the story that came with that photograph. You saw all that huge long form for all the collection info that they took. All right. Oh, looking at my chat. So Skits and Tams and Brianna all really, really like the story. And Skit says, this is a cool challenge this week. What kind of stories would you both share? And that's a great question.
That's a good question.
Do you want me to start?
I think I can start.
Okay.
Because I'm reminded of something, having read this book. Much like Angelina in our story, I remember starting at a new school and walking into a classroom where nobody else in the class looked like me. And I'll admit, I wasn't quite as brave as the kids in the book were. It takes courage to tell your stories. And on the first day, I was feeling more scared than courageous. I remember finding a seat and putting my knapsack down, and I didn't really have any plan to tell my story that day. Not in a room that felt very unlike me. That was until a boy sitting next to me noticed that I had a Toronto Raptors keychain on my bag. And he said, "You like the Raptors?" And it was from that small question, that little invitation, that I began to share my story. I mean, would I have shared my story, shared who I was without the question? Probably. But did I feel much more welcome and comfortable sharing because of that question? Definitely. So I think something for those of you who feel comfortable sharing your stories, who feel comfortable in a space, I'd encourage you to create a chance for somebody who may have a story very different from yours, who might not feel comfortable sharing it, to share theirs. You can create that invitation. It's how we can support one another. And I think also it's a big part of how we connect.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an amazing point. And it really kind of helps everybody too. A lot of people don't know, but I have autism. And when I was growing up, I often didn't know when it was time to share the story. So sometimes just having that little invitation is a really good opportunity to make somebody who's uncertain just feel a little bit more confident and comfortable opening up. Yeah. So for my story, mine's a little bit different. The story that I would share is about, it's hard to see because it's under you, about my tattoo. And the reason why I would share this is because people who know me really well would think that I was the last person to get a tattoo, because I can't even get a second set of holes in my ears. And it's not because I don't like them. It's because I start going like, oh, it's so permanent. It's such a big decision. Do I want to do it? And then I just second guess myself out of ever doing it. But the decision to get this tattoo, and I have to stand up to show it off properly for my friends, was actually pretty easy. So my tattoo is of flowers called bougainvilleas. And the last conversation I ever had with my mom was she was showing me her bougainvilleas and how they had bloomed to welcome her home. So after my mom passed away last year, I got this tattoo so that she would always be with me and so that I would always carry home with me as well. And it's a little story, and it's a story that a lot of people don't think of when they think of what is this tattoo about. Plus, it's really pretty. That's the other reason I got it. But yeah, there's a lot of hidden stories that we have. Aw, thank you, Skids.
And thank you for sharing that, Sarah. And thank you for the chat, for inviting us to share our stories. Because I think, like I said, it's that invitation that lets us learn something that I didn't know about you, Sarah. That helps us kind of find ways to connect with each other in a new way.
Yeah. So Elise has another question, which I think is a really great question that kind of leads off of what we've been talking about. So she says, museums often tell big stories of civilizations and the big picture of history. How common is it for museums to tell smaller stories like the ROM exhibit on family photos? That's a great question, right?
I think it is a really good question. And I think for a museum like the ROM, that is a big museum, folks often think about us for telling big stories. But I would say that some of the more important stories we tell are the smaller stories, like Family Camera. We have exhibitions at the museum. That's when we put a bunch of objects into a space, write some text, and tell a story about them. And we, every year, try to make some big exhibitions and some small exhibitions that tell those smaller stories. So Family Camera is a good example of a more recent, small story, but very impactful and meaningful. We also had a smaller exhibition called Here We Are Here, which was about the Black Canadian experience in Canada. And those are the stories that ultimately we as museums want to create space to tell. at the ROM, we have dinosaurs and we have a lot of objects from all over the world, but how do we find space to tell the small stories that connect to people on maybe a more personal level? And that's part of the work I do every day. And I don't think we're ever done that work. We're always aiming to do more.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite ones that came through, it's kind of an example of finding smaller stories in a bigger story. So we had one of those big exhibitions, Treasures from the Desert Kingdom, and it was things from the former royal family of Jodhpur, India. And those stories, the ones that we look at, the things that we see in paintings, they're all about the royal family. So for our gallery trail, for students who were visiting and going through with their school, another teacher at the ROM, his name is Sudarshan, he and I wrote a gallery trail which was all about finding the stories that are told by these big objects that tell the stories of the people who you don't see. So if you have this like big mural of the king and the royal family, you see these gardens, and that tells you that there were gardeners there doing their jobs, and it tells you there were painters there, and all the jewelry tells you that there were jewelers there doing their jobs as well. So there are so many people whose stories are told, even though they don't appear within these paintings, if you know how to read them properly. And so what we are doing is trying to teach people how to read the objects to find the hidden stories within them.
That's great. I think trying to find those smaller, maybe hidden stories is an important part of any type of museum, and any type of museum visitor. I would say if you're going to a museum, ask whose stories aren't being told, and ask why.
So that leads into another couple of really great comments in the chat. So Elise says to you specifically that it's a wonderful job that you do, and to thank you for what you do.
Thanks, Elise.
And Skits asks, so how does the museum find ways for people to tell their stories?
That's a really good question, Skits. And I think it builds a little bit on what Sarah and I were just talking about, and particularly when I was mentioning the stories that aren't told. Because I think before we talk about whose stories museums tell, we have to say that museums have not always been good at letting people tell their own stories. In the past, we've heard a story and tried to retell it, or told our own version, which wasn't right, or left out stories entirely. And when we do that, and when we've done that, it's upsetting to people whose stories we've told badly or not at all. So part of my work at the museum is to make sure everybody can share their story. And I think Family Camera was a really nice example of that, where we collected all these stories from all these people, and it was those people who told their stories. It wasn't me or Sarah sitting there writing about this one picture that we found that was contributed. Those people shared what that image, what that object, what the story of that thing was. But beyond Family Camera, for me, making sure that we find ways for people to tell their stories can mean working with people from a specific culture or background to help guide the museum in the way that they would like their stories to be told. It can mean talking to members of our communities about our ideas, or partnering with organizations who understand the stories better than we do. But it's also important to realize when we haven't told a story well, and if we haven't, we need to make sure that we make it better.
Yeah, and it's a good point that we are always learning and we are always working. And it's important too, when we're telling stories, one of the things that we started to do in the learning department is, if we're telling a story that we heard from somebody else, we make sure that we say who we heard that story from. And that helps maintain the chain of where that story came from. And it means that if people really like the story and if they're curious about it, they can go back and find the person that we learned the story from and hear it from them as well. Because one of the things that happens with storytelling is they're going to change a little bit as you tell them. It's human nature. We put pieces of ourselves in the stories we tell. We can't help it. And that's why stories change and evolve all the time. It's why we have so many different versions of really similar stories that we heard growing up. Yeah. Skits is asking, what are some of our favorite stories in the museum?
I'll let you go first on this one, Sarah.
Okay. I have so many stories. It's really hard to pick. It's like picking your favorite kid. And I talked about one of them, which was the hidden stories in Treasures of a Desert Kingdom. But I think in terms of stories in the museum, one of my favorite kind of really big changes that the museum has made over the past couple of years is in the First Peoples Gallery. Now we have Indigenous knowledge resource teachers who are in there on school days from 10 to 2 telling the stories of the objects in there and their own personal stories and how they relate to it. And I love that we actually have, instead of just labels in front of things, we have people, our Indigenous knowledge resource teachers, who can tell these stories that they lived and they grew up with and that they choose to share with people. So I think I have so many, but that is one of my favorite really big changes over the last few years.
Yeah. I've got my kind of fun museum story, which I always like the story about our Barosaurus. Do you know this story, Sarah?
Yes. And I know, again, I know different versions of this story as well.
Okay, so I'll share the story or the version of the story that I know. So the museum was opening the crystal, which is the big metal and glass part of the museum. And our curator was looking at the dinosaur gallery and thinking, I really need a good big dinosaur to really kind of fill this gallery out. And he was traveling on a plane down to the United States to explore what dinosaur they might be able to find to put in that gallery. And as he was on the plane, he was looking through records and academic stuff of where a dinosaur called a Barosaurus might be. And as he was scrolling through the registries and the lists, he found that way a long time ago, a Barosaurus had been transferred from, I believe it was a museum in Pittsburgh, to the Royal Ontario Museum. So he arrived in the airport and called the people who work back at the museum in our storage areas and said, hey, I think we might have a gigantic dinosaur hiding in our storage. So folks scrambled throughout the storage, and one person pulled out a big leg bone, another pulled out a vertebrae, which is a bone in your back, another person pulled out a rib, and eventually they called him back to say that we had perhaps, and I think now it's confirmed, the most complete Barosaurus skeleton in North America. And that became our dinosaur. That was our anchor dinosaur in our gallery. So
you can see him from outside on the street.
You
don't even have to go into the museum. You can walk by. You'll see it on our thanks for watching screen. You can walk by that big glass window and you can see the Barosaurus.
Yeah. So I think talking about stories, I think it's also important to think about the stories we forget and how important they can be, and that re-sharing those stories are important for not only the work that one curator does, but the work that an entire museum can do.
And I love that you shared that story, because I've heard a version of that story, not from the curator, but from the technicians who work on the bones.
Ooh.
And their version of the story is like, no, we always knew it was there. But people need to talk to us. So I think it's a really, really great example about how it's important not just to tell our own stories, but also to listen to the stories of others and to invite those stories, because they knew. It drives him crazy when people talk about the lost dinosaurs. Like, we didn't lose it, we knew it was there. And Skits is asking how you lose an entire dinosaur in the back room. So we're going to share a secret. it's not just a back room. There is a whole other secret building somewhere in Ontario where we keep the stuff that isn't on display. Because there's over 13 million objects in the ROM's collections. They don't all fit in that one building. Not anymore.
Yes. It is still a very good question, though.
It is an amazing
and one that
question.
I still ask myself every time I tell that story.
You gotta talk to people.
Yeah.
You gotta talk to the people who take care of the things. They know.
Yeah.
That was such a great question, though. All right, so it looks like we are running out of questions in the chat. And so do we want to introduce next week's book?
Sure.
Christian is going to come back next week so that we can read Hair Love. And I am really excited to read that one with you. That was so much fun. So what did you think? Your very first ROM story time.
Ooh, it was fun.
It was.
A little less nervous, a little less scared, because I mean, I was coming on here to share some stories as well. Like the book that we just read, it can be a little scary, it can be a little nerve-wracking. But I think you, Sarah, and everybody in the chat you were the people who extended that invitation today. So thank you all for that.
And our chat is lovely. Skits is saying that they're now imagining a dinosaur skeleton being used as a coat rack, which is why nobody could find it.
I mean, I might contribute that to the story we tell now.
Oh, that is great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Christian, for helping bring this story to life this week. And if there are no other questions in the chat, then we are going to say goodbye, everybody, and we will see you next Tuesday. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.